Park Eunji was everything she'd chosen to become, and that transformation had been accomplished entirely through her own courage, love, and refusal to accept someone else's definition of her worth. 4 years later, the unexpected opportunity. The conference room at Technova was filled with tension so thick it was almost visible. Eunji sat at the head of the table, surrounded by the company's senior leadership team, staring at documents that represented both crisis and opportunity. Daejin Industries is bankrupt, Eunji asked, hardly believing what she was reading. Jung Dongwon, who had promoted her to coup 3 years ago, and had become not just her boss but her mentor, nodded grimly. Complete financial collapse. They've been losing money for 5 years, bad investments, failed product launches, and apparently some serious mismanagement at the executive level. What does this have to do with us? Asked Lee Young-young, their CFO. Everything, Dongwon replied. Daejin Industries owns the patent portfolio for industrial automation systems that would be perfect for our AI platform. If we could acquire those patents, we'd dominate the entire manufacturing sector. Yoonji's mind was racing. Daejin Industries, the company where Byungchul worked. The promotion he'd left her for had been at Daejin Industries. What would an acquisition cost? Yoonji asked, forcing her voice to remain steady and professional. The bankruptcy court is accepting bids. Based on our analysis, we'd need approximately 50 billion won to acquire the core technology assets and restructure the remaining operations. 50 billion won. Technova was successful, but they didn't have that kind of capital readily available. We'd need investors, Eunji said thoughtfully. Major investors willing to back a risky acquisition of a bankrupt company. Dongwon leaned forward, his expression serious. That's why I wanted to discuss this with you first, Eunji. You've built incredible relationships with our investment network. If anyone can convince investors to back this move, it's you. Over the next 3 months, Eunji worked harder than she'd ever worked in her life. She met with investment firms, venture capital partners, and private equity groups throughout Seoul, Busan, and even flew to Singapore and Hong Kong to present Technova's acquisition strategy. Her presentation was compelling. Daejin Industries had failed not because their technology was bad, but because their business operations were disastrous. With Technova's operational excellence and AI platform integration, the acquired assets could be transformed into a market-leading solution. You're asking us to invest in a company that just went bankrupt, one skeptical investor had said during a particularly challenging pitch meeting. I'm asking you to invest in proven technology that was destroyed by poor management, Youngji had replied firmly. The assets are sound. The leadership was flawed. We have sound leadership and need the assets. This is exactly the kind of strategic acquisition that creates market dominance. Her confidence, her detailed financial analysis, and her track record at Technova gradually won over investor after investor. 6 months after Dongwon had first mentioned the opportunity, Technova secured 50 billion won in acquisition financing from a consortium of Korean and international investors. The bankruptcy court approved Technova's bid, and suddenly, Park Eunji found herself as the chief operating officer of a newly merged company with 200 employees, annual revenue of 50 billion won, and a technology portfolio that positioned them as a major player in Korea's industrial automation sector. But the most significant aspect of the acquisition came during the due diligence process. When Eunji was reviewing the organizational chart of Daejin Industries' surviving management structure, there, in black and white, was a name that made her heart stop. Kim Byungchul, Chief Executive Officer, the man who had abandoned her 9 years ago, who had called her worthless, who had said she would never amount to anything, was now technically an employee of the company she helped run. The irony was so profound that Yoonji had to sit down in her office and simply breathe for several minutes. Yoonji Seonim Chowan appeared in the doorway, using the more respectful title that had become appropriate after the acquisition. The integration team needs to discuss the management restructuring for the Daejin division. There are some sensitive personnel decisions. Yoonji looked up at her assistant. How sensitive? The former CEO of Daejin Industries, Kim Byungchul, has requested a meeting to discuss his future role in the merged company. For 9 years, Yoonji had wondered what she would feel if she ever saw Byungchul again. Anger, pain, satisfaction. But sitting in her office, looking at the merger documents that proved how far she'd come, she felt only a strange sort of peace. Schedule the meeting, Eunji said quietly. It's time we had a conversation. 3 months after the acquisition, the merger announcement, the Westin Chosun Hotel's grand ballroom was filled with Seoul's business elite, gathered for the official announcement of the Technova Digital Industries merger and the introduction of the newly formed company, Nova Industries Corporation. Youngji stood backstage in the hotel's preparation area, reviewing her speech one final time. In 30 minutes, she would walk onto that stage as the newly appointed Chief Operating Officer of Nova Industries, a company with 300 employees, 80 billion won in annual revenue, and a technology portfolio that positioned them as a major player in Korea's industrial sector. "Iyama, you look like a CEO," Do-yeon said, straightening his tie with serious concentration. "You look like someone important," Dong-hae added, his eyes shining with pride. At 9 years old, both boys had accompanied her to several business events, but tonight felt different. Tonight, they would see their mother celebrated as one of Korea's rising business leaders. "Remember what we practiced," Yoonji said gently. "You'll be seated in the front section with the other VIP families. Sit up straight, be respectful, and remember that you represent our family tonight. We won't let you down," Iyama Do-yeon promised. As the boys were escorted to their seats, Dong-won appeared beside Yoonji, looking nervous but excited. "Are you ready for this?" he asked. "This is going to be huge. Every major business publication in Korea is here. Plus, we have representatives from 3 of our international partners." "I'm ready," Yoongi replied, and she meant it. "There's something you should know," Dong-won said carefully. "Kim Byungchul is here. He arrived about 20 minutes ago with some of the other Daejin legacy executives. I wanted you to be prepared." Yoonji's pulse quickened, but she kept her voice steady. "Thank you for the warning. Has he seen the full organizational chart yet? Does he know who I am?" Dong-won shook his head. "We've kept the coup announcement confidential until tonight. The invitation went out under Technova leadership, and most of the former Daejin executives don't know about your role yet. Byungchul probably thinks he's here for his own announcement. He's been trying to position himself for a senior executive role in the merged company." The irony was almost too much. "And his actual position?" "Department director reporting to you. We're keeping him on for 6 months to transition his institutional knowledge. Then we'll evaluate whether there's a long-term role. Honestly, based on the due diligence, his management decisions were a significant contributor to Daejeon's bankruptcy." Youngji took a deep breath. 9 years ago, Byungchul had left her for a director position at Daejin Industries. Now he was hoping to keep that same position in a company where she was coup. "It's almost time," Dong-won said. "The MC is about to introduce us." As Yoonji walked toward the stage entrance, she caught a glimpse of the ballroom through the curtain gap. 500 guests filled the elegant space. Business leaders, investors, technology partners, and media representatives, all gathered to learn about the newly formed Nova Industries. And there, in the 4th row, sitting among the other Daejin legacy executives, was Kim Byungchul. At 38 he was still handsome, his dark hair now showing distinguished touches of silver, his expensive suit perfectly tailored. But there was something different about him, something that suggested the past 9 years hadn't been as triumphant as he'd probably imagined. Yoonji felt her heart rate steady as she looked at him. This man had once made her feel worthless. He'd abandoned her when she was pregnant, called her trash, predicted she would never survive without him. And now she stood backstage, about to walk onto that stage as the chief operating officer of the company he worked for. The MC's voice carried clearly through the ballroom. "Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome to the stage the leadership team of Nova Industries Corporation. First, our Chief Executive Officer and founder of Technova, Jung Dong-won." Dong-won walked onto the stage to enthusiastic applause. The crowd knew him as one of Korea's most successful young entrepreneurs, a tech innovator who had built Technova from a struggling startup into a major player in the automation sector. "And now," the MC continued, "please welcome our Chief Operating Officer, the strategic mind behind Technova's remarkable growth, and the architect of the Daejin Industries acquisition, Park Eunji." Eunji stepped onto the stage, her midnight blue hanbok-inspired business suit flowing elegantly as she walked. The ballroom erupted in applause, but she could hear the undercurrent of whispered conversations spreading through the crowd as people registered who she was. From the stage, Eunji had a perfect view of the entire ballroom. She could see the business leaders who had invested in her company, the technology partners who had worked with her, the media representatives who had covered Technova's rise. And she could see Kim Byungchul's face transforming completely as recognition hit him like a physical blow. First came confusion. Surely this couldn't be the same Park Eunji he'd married 9 years ago. This elegant, confident businesswoman who commanded the stage with natural authority couldn't possibly be the woman he'd called worthless and left in a tiny official apartment. Then came recognition, dawning slowly but undeniably. The shape of her face, the way she carried herself, something in her smile as she greeted the audience. This was Park Eunji. But it wasn't until Youngji's gaze swept across the audience and landed briefly on the VIP family section that Byungchul saw what made his face go completely white. Doyeon and Donghae sat in the front row of the family section. Both boys wearing perfectly tailored suits, sitting with the kind of composed dignity that suggested they were accustomed to attending high-profile business events. Doyeon, with his strong jaw and natural confidence, was unmistakably Byungchul's son. The resemblance was so strong it was almost startling. The same bone structure, the same way of holding his shoulders, the same inherent authority. Donghae, more thoughtful but equally poised, carried Byungchul's distinctive features softened by Yoonji's more delicate characteristics. There was no question, no possibility of doubt. These were Kim Byungchul's children raised to be exceptional young men, despite, or perhaps because of, his complete absence from their lives. Yeonji watched Byungchul's face cycle through emotions too quickly to track shock, disbelief, dawning comprehension, and something that might have been the first stirrings of regret. Thank you all for joining us tonight. Yeonji's voice carried clearly through the ballroom, warm and professional. I'm honored to stand before you as the Chief Operating Officer of Nova Industries Corporation, and I'm excited to share our vision for the future of industrial automation in Korea and throughout Asia. She delivered her speech with the kind of confidence that comes from genuine expertise and hard-won success. She outlined the acquisition strategy, detailed the technology integration plans, and presented financial projections that made several investors nod with satisfaction. Throughout her presentation, Eunji could feel Byungchul's eyes on her, watching this transformation he'd never imagined possible. The woman he'd called worthless was commanding the attention and respect of Seoul's business elite, discussing billion-won investments and strategic market positioning with the ease of someone who genuinely belonged in this world. When the presentation concluded to enthusiastic applause, Dongwon stepped forward to announce the organizational structure of the new company. Our executive leadership team represents the best talent from both Technova and Daijin Industries, he said. However, I want to be clear that Nova Industries is built on a foundation of operational excellence and strategic thinking. Those who contributed to the previous company's success will continue to thrive. Those who contributed to its failures will be given the opportunity to learn, grow, or transition to other opportunities. The message was diplomatic but clear. The former Daijin executives would not be automatically elevated simply because of their previous positions. As the formal program ended, guests moved into the adjacent gallery for the reception. Youngji stepped down from the stage and was soon greeted by investors, partners, and colleagues offering congratulations. Park Sejong-nim, a familiar voice, said warmly. Yoonji turned to see Senator Choi approaching with a smile. That was an impressive presentation. I wasn't aware Technova's coup was so accomplished. Your perspective on the merger was very insightful. Thank you, Senator Yoonji replied. I appreciate your support. The pleasure is mine, he said. And those two young gentlemen seated over there are they part of your family? Yes, Yoonji said gently. My sons Doyeon and Donghae, they're 9. They carry themselves well, the senator noted. You've clearly done a wonderful job. As the conversation continued, Yoonji noticed quiet attention shifting nearby. Byungchul stood a short distance away, observing the scene silently. A few guests exchanged curious glances as they noticed the resemblance between him and the boys, though no one spoke openly about it. Doyeon and Donghae soon joined their mother, standing comfortably at her side. "Emma, you did great," Doyeon said softly. "We were proud watching you," Donghae added. Youngji smiled and rested a hand on each of their shoulders. After a moment, Byungchul approached slowly, stopping a respectful distance away. "Youngji," he said quietly, "it's been a long time." "Yes," she replied calmly. "It has." His gaze moved briefly to the boys. "They seem very bright." "They are," Youngji said simply. "They've grown well." There was a pause, neither tense nor dramatic. "I didn't expect to see you here," Byungchul said. "Life has a way of moving forward," Youngji replied evenly. The boys stood quietly, sensing no discomfort, only conversation. "I'm glad to see things turned out well," Byungchul said after a moment. "So am I," Youngji answered. Around them, the reception continued: soft music, polite conversation, and the steady rhythm of a successful evening. "I chose to raise two exceptional children while building my own career. We both got exactly what we chose." Senator Choi, who had been listening with growing disapproval, stepped forward. "Kim Byungchul, is this true? You abandoned your pregnant wife?" Before Byungchul could answer, Dongwon approached with several other senior executives, his expression grave. "I think this conversation should continue in a more private setting," Dongwon said diplomatically. Though his tone made it clear this wasn't a suggestion. "Byungchul, my office. Now." As Byungchul was escorted away by the executive team, Younggi felt the crowd's energy shift completely. The business leaders and investors who had gathered to celebrate the merger were now looking at her with a mixture of admiration and sympathy. Park Sajin-nim, an older businessman, approached, his face showing genuine respect. "I'm CEO Park of Daehan Mattel Industries. I've known Kim Byungchul professionally for years, but I had no idea about his personal history. Your grace in this situation is remarkable. And your sons, they're clearly exceptional young men." "Thank you, Park Seo-nim. I want you to know," CEO Park continued, "that Daehan Mattel has been considering expanding our automation systems. After tonight, after seeing your presentation and your character, I'd like to discuss a partnership with Nova Industries. I want to work with people who demonstrate real values, not just business acumen." Similar conversations followed throughout the evening. Business leaders who had attended expecting a straightforward merger announcement had instead witnessed a dramatic revelation that fundamentally changed how they viewed both Youngji and Byung. Youngji was being celebrated not just for her business success, but for her resilience, her dignity, and her ability to raise exceptional children while building a remarkable career. Byungchul, meanwhile, was facing questions and reconsideration from every professional contact in the room. The private meeting in Dongwon's office lasted for over an hour. Byungchul sat across from the executive team, Dongwon Youngji, and the company's legal counsel, looking like a man watching his life unravel in real time. "I think we need to address some serious concerns about your role in this company," Dongwon said. His voice professionally neutral, but his disapproval clear. "The due diligence revealed significant issues with decision-making during your tenure at Daehan Industries. Tonight's revelation adds another dimension to our evaluation of your judgment and character." "This is a personal matter," Byungchul said desperately. "It shouldn't affect my professional position." "Everything affects professional position," Youngji said quietly. "Character isn't something you turn on and off, depending on whether you're at work or home. The same judgment that led you to make poor personal choices also contributed to the professional decisions that bankrupted Daehan Industries." The legal counsel slid a document across the table. "We're offering you a transition package, Byung. 3 months severance, continuation of benefits for 6 months, and a letter of recommendation for positions at other companies contingent on your signing this agreement that includes a non-disparagement clause." "You're firing me?" Byungchul looked between them with disbelief. "After 9 years at Daehan Industries, after everything I built there." "You didn't build Daehan Industries," Dongwon corrected firmly. "You contributed to its bankruptcy through a series of poor strategic decisions that our analysis has documented extensively. The merger saved the technology assets, but we're not obligated to retain executives whose judgment has been consistently flawed." Byungchul turned to Youngji, his expression desperate. "This is about what happened 9 years ago. You're getting revenge. This has nothing to do with revenge, Eunji replied calmly. If your performance had been exceptional, we would have kept you regardless of our personal history. But your performance was mediocre at best and destructive at worst. The personal revelation tonight simply confirmed what the professional analysis already showed you. Make poor decisions based on short-term thinking and ego rather than sound judgment. The meeting concluded with Byungchul signing the separation agreement, his hands shaking as he wrote his name. As he stood to leave, he paused at the door. Can I see them? The boys? Can I get to know them? Eunji looked at him for a long moment. That's not my decision to make alone. Doyeon and Donhae are 9 years old. They're old enough to have opinions about who they want in their lives. If they ever want to meet you, I won't stop them. But I also won't force them to have a relationship with someone who rejected them before they were born. I didn't know they would turn out so exceptional. And that's exactly the problem, Eunji said quietly. You only want to know them now because they're successful, accomplished, impressive. But they were worthy of your love and attention from the moment they were conceived. Their worth wasn't dependent on their achievements. Your inability to see that is why you don't deserve them now. The wedding invitation was delivered to Byungchul's new apartment in Mapogua, modest 2-bedroom, that was worlds away from the luxury apartment in Gangnam he'd once occupied. Since leaving Nova Industries, he'd found work as a mid-level manager at a smaller consulting firm. A position that paid adequately but represented a significant step down from the executive track he'd once occupied. The cream-colored envelope felt expensive in his hands, and his heart stopped when he saw the return address. Park Eunji inside. The invitation was simple and elegant. You are cordially invited to celebrate the promotion ceremony. Park Eunji, Chief Executive Officer, Nova Industries Corporation, the Grand Hyatt Seoul. There was a handwritten note attached in Eunji's familiar script. Byungchul, I thought you might want to witness how well some people's lives turn out when they refuse to accept someone else's definition of their worth. You once said I was worthless and would never amount to anything without you. I'd like you to see exactly how wrong you were. I'm not inviting you to be cruel. I'm inviting you because I genuinely hope you've learned something from your choices. Perhaps seeing what you walked away from will help you make better decisions in the future. The boys will be there. They've been asking questions about you. This might be an opportunity for you to meet them properly, not as the father who abandoned them, but as someone who is trying to become better. Eunji? Byungchul stared at the invitation for a long time. 3 months ago, he'd been CEO of Daijin Industries, on track for what he'd thought would be a triumphant career milestone. Instead, he'd discovered that the woman he'd discarded had become the coup of the company acquiring his bankrupt business, that he had 2 exceptional sons he'd never known, and that every professional contact who mattered in Seoul now knew about his choices. The past 3 months had been humbling in ways he'd never imagined. Former colleagues avoided his calls. Business opportunities disappeared. Invitations to industry events stopped arriving. He'd gone from being a rising executive to someone whose professional reputation was fundamentally questioned. But more than the professional consequences, Byungchul had spent 3 months thinking about Doyeon and Donhae, his sons, 2 boys he'd rejected without ever meeting, who had grown into remarkable young men without any contribution from him. He picked up his phone and typed a response to Eunji. I'll be there. And thank you for the chance to meet them properly. The Grand Hyatt Seoul's ballroom was filled with business leaders, technology partners, and investors who had watched Nova Industries transform from a merger-born company into a major player in Korea's industrial automation sector over the past 6 months. Park Eunji stood backstage, reviewing her acceptance speech one final time. At 30 years old, she was about to become the CEO of a company with 400 employees and 150 billion won in annual revenue. Dongwon was transitioning to chairman of the board, moving into an advisory role that would let him pursue other entrepreneurial interests. Iyama, are you nervous? Doyeon asked, straightening his tie with practiced ease. A little, Eunji admitted, but good nervous, excited nervous. We saw him arrive, Donghae said quietly. The man who's our father. He's sitting in the back section. Eunji knelt down to her son's level. How do you feel about that? We talked about him being here, but I want to make sure you're okay. Doyeon considered carefully. I'm curious, I guess. I want to see what kind of person he is now. Not who he was 9 years ago, but who he became. And maybe, Donghae added thoughtfully, we want to show him who we are. Not to prove anything, but just so he knows. You don't have to prove anything to anyone, Eunji said firmly. You're already everything you need to be. We know, Doyeon replied with a maturity beyond his years. But sometimes showing people what they lost helps them understand their mistakes better. The ceremony began with speeches from board members and major investors, all celebrating Eunji's promotion and the company's remarkable success. When it was her turn to speak, Youngji walked onto the stage to thunderous applause. From the stage, she could see the entire ballroom. Business leaders who had supported her journey, investors who had believed in her vision, colleagues who had worked alongside her. And in the back section, almost hidden in the crowd, sat Kim Byungchul, watching her with an expression of complex emotions she couldn't quite read. Thank you all for being here tonight, Yoonji began, her voice carrying clearly through the ballroom. When I stood in front of many of you 6 months ago as the newly appointed coup of Nova Industries, I shared our vision for the future of industrial automation. Tonight, I'm honored to stand before you as CEO, and I'm excited to share how much closer we are to achieving that vision. She delivered her speech with confidence and expertise, outlining the company's growth, celebrating the team's achievements, and presenting ambitious but achievable goals for the future. But it was the final section of her speech that captured everyone's attention. I want to take a moment to acknowledge that success isn't just measured in revenue and market position, Yoonji said, her voice taking on a more personal tone. Success is also measured in resilience, in the ability to face adversity and transform it into opportunity, and in the courage to rebuild when everything seems broken. She paused, her eyes finding Doyeon and Donghae in the front row. 9 years ago, I was told that I was worthless, that I would never amount to anything, that I was a burden who couldn't possibly survive on my own. I was left alone pregnant with twins, living in a basement apartment, working 3 jobs to make ends meet. The ballroom had gone completely silent. I could have believed those words. I could have accepted that definition of my worth. But I had 2 babies depending on me, and their existence reminded me every day that I had value beyond anyone else's opinion of me. Yeonji's voice grew stronger. I cleaned offices at night while studying business operations. I consulted for startups while raising toddlers in a 2-room apartment. I built relationships, developed expertise, and slowly, steadily proved to myself, not to anyone else, but to myself, that worth is inherent, not assigned. She smiled at the crowd. Tonight, I stand before you as the CEO of Nova Industries, not in spite of my struggles, but because of them. Every challenge taught me something essential about resilience, creativity, and the power of refusing to accept someone else's limitations on your potential. The applause was deafening, but Yoonji noticed that many people in the audience were wiping their eyes. As the formal ceremony concluded, the reception began. Yoonji was immediately surrounded by well-wishers, but she kept one eye on Doyeon and Donghae, who were standing near the refreshment area, clearly waiting for something. Byungchul approached them slowly, his expression showing both nervousness and determination. "Excuse me," he said quietly when he reached the boys. "I'm Kim Byungchul. I think I'm your father." Doyeon studied him carefully, his young face showing impressive composure. "We know who you are. Yama told us about you. She said you didn't want children," Donghae added, his tone matter-of-fact rather than accusatory. "She said you chose not to be part of our lives." Byungchul looked like he'd been struck. "I made a terrible mistake. I was young and stupid and focused on all the wrong things. I didn't understand what our value was." Dojeon finished for him. "Yama taught us that our value isn't dependent on whether other people recognize it. We would have been just as valuable 9 years ago as we are now, but you couldn't see it." "You're very wise for 9 years old," Byungchul said, his voice thick with emotion. "We had to be," Donghae replied simply. "Growing up without a father meant we had to understand things earlier than other kids." Yeonji approached quietly, giving her sons the space to have this conversation, but staying close enough to intervene if needed. "They're remarkable," Byungchul said to her, his eyes shining with tears. I can't believe I missed watching them grow up. You didn't miss it, Eunji corrected gently. You chose not to be there for it. There's a difference. Can I? Byungchul's voice broke. Can I be part of their lives now? I know I don't deserve it, but I'd like to try to know them, if they're willing. Eunji looked at Doyeon and Donghae. This is your decision, Ajit. You don't owe him anything. Whatever you choose, I'll support it. The twins looked at each other, having one of those silent conversations that only twins can have. We'd be willing to meet sometimes, Doyeon said slowly. Not as a father exactly, but as someone we'd like to get to know. But you have to understand you're not replacing anything in our lives. Iyama gave us everything we needed. You'd be additional, I guess. Not essential. I understand, Byungchul said quickly. That's more than I deserve. And you have to promise, Donghae added seriously, that you won't hurt Iyama again. She's the strongest person we know, but she's also our mother, and we protect her. I promise, Byungchul replied, his voice breaking completely. I spent 9 years thinking I made the right choice. Now, I know it was the biggest mistake of my life. As the evening concluded and guests began to depart, Eunji stood with her sons, watching Byungchul leave the ballroom. He looked smaller somehow, humbled by the confrontation with what he'd lost. Do you think he'll actually try to be better? Doyeon asked. I don't know, Eunji replied honestly. But that's his journey to make ours is complete. Not complete, Donghae corrected with a smile. Just beginning the next chapter. Eunji pulled both boys close, overwhelmed with gratitude for the life they'd built together. You're right, and I can't wait to see what comes next. 1 year later, the invitation was simple. An elegant cream-colored paper with beautiful calligraphy. You are invited to celebrate the grand opening of the UNG Foundation for Single Parents, supporting business, education, childcare, and economic opportunity. Byungchul held the invitation in his hands, reading it for the 3rd time. 1 year had passed since UNG CEO promotion ceremony. 1 year of slowly, carefully building a relationship with Doyeon and Donghae, meeting them for monthly lunches, attending their school events, learning about their interests and dreams. It wasn't a father-son relationship, not really. Byungchul had missed too much for that. But it was something, a connection built on honesty, respect, and his genuine effort to become someone worthy of their time. He would attend the foundation opening, not as a VIP or a major donor, but as someone who had learned an essential lesson about worth, value, and the consequences of letting ego guide your choices. The foundation Eunji had created would help single parents like she had once been, providing business education, subsidized childcare, microloans for entrepreneurs, and mentorship from successful business leaders who understood the challenges of building a career while raising children alone. It was exactly the kind of support Eunji had needed 9 years ago when she was cleaning offices at night with babies strapped to her chest. Byungchul made a donation to the foundation, not anonymous, but not seeking recognition, simply contributing because it was the right thing to do. Meanwhile, across Seoul, Park Eunji stood in the beautiful new headquarters of the Eunji Foundation, surrounded by her sons now 10 years old and preparing to enter middle school and the hundreds of families her organization would help. She had never forgotten where she came from. She had never forgotten the struggle, the fear, the nights of wondering if she was strong enough. And now, she would make sure that other parents facing similar challenges would have support, resources, and hope. Because that was what real success looked like. Not proving others wrong, but lifting others up. Not seeking revenge, but creating opportunity. Not dwelling on the past, but building a better future. Doyeon and Donghae stood beside their mother as she cut the ribbon, their faces full of pride and love. They had never needed the father who abandoned them. They had their Iyamanon. She had always been more than enough. As the celebration continued and single parents shared their stories of struggle and hope, Eunji felt a profound sense of completion. Kim Byungchul had called her worthless and predicted she would never survive without him. But Park Eunji had not only survived, she had built an empire, raised exceptional children, and was now using her success to create opportunities for others facing the same challenges she had overcome. The woman who had once cleaned offices at midnight was now creating pathways for others to achieve their own dreams. The mother who had once worried about affording formula for her twins was now funding scholarships for children of single parents. The person who had been called worthless had proven that worth is inherent, powerful, and impossible to destroy, no matter how many people fail to recognize it, and that made all the difference. If this story inspired you, please like, subscribe, and share. Drop a comment. What's the most important lesson you took from this story? Thanks for watching Korean Animated Stories by G. See you in the next one.